I couldn't afford coffee on a blind date until the stranger behind me paid and became the man I couldn't stop thinking about. Sienna Marsh was sitting across from a guy named Greg at Cornerstone Cafe on a Saturday morning in mid-November, trying to figure out how much longer she had to pretend to care about his philosophy on optimizing daily caloric intake before she could politely excuse herself and never speak to her coworker Kelsey again for setting this up. 28 years old, seamstress at Parkview Dry Cleaners and Alterations in Tacoma, Washington, and she'd spent the last 45 minutes listening to Greg explain his color-coded spreadsheet system for tracking personal expenses down to the penny, his meal prep routine that involved weighing chicken breast portions on a digital scale, and his opinion that most people fail financially because they lack what he called logistical foresight. Greg was wearing a button-down shirt tucked into chinos on a Saturday morning and had the kind of energy that suggested he'd never encountered a spontaneous decision he didn't immediately analyze for efficiency metrics. The cafe was packed with the usual weekend crowd, families with kids and college students camping out with laptops and a line at the counter that stretched back to the door. And the whole place smelled like espresso and baked goods and had this warm, bustling energy that would have been nice if Sienna wasn't trapped in a conversation about macro tracking. She'd been at work since 6 that morning, finishing a rush alteration on a wedding dress, had gone home to change into clean jeans and a sweater that didn't have threads stuck to it, and honestly, she was only here because Kelsey had guilted her about never giving anyone a chance and being married to her sewing machine. Greg was in the middle of explaining why he refused to use credit cards because the psychological disconnect from physical cash led to overspending when Sienna realized she'd stopped listening 3 minutes ago and was just nodding at intervals. Should we grab coffee? I need caffeine to properly engage with the rest of my Saturday optimization plan, Greg said, standing up and gesturing toward the counter like he was directing a tactical operation. And Sienna followed him to the line because leaving now would require an excuse she hadn't prepared yet. They stood in line for about 5 minutes while Greg talked about his French press technique at home. Sienna had noticed the handwritten card reader down, cash only today sign taped to the entrance, but didn't think much of it. When they finally got close enough to see the counter, she tried to remember what bills she actually had in her wallet because she almost never carried cash. Everything went on her debit card, and she couldn't remember if she stopped at an ATM recently or if she had bills in there from anything. Greg stepped up to order and got a large cold brew in a protein box, and the barista rang him up for $12.60, and Greg pulled out his wallet, and Sienna saw he had at least a couple 20s in there, and he peeled one off and handed it over without issue. The barista made change, and Greg carefully organized the bills and coins into different sections of his wallet, while Sienna tried to calculate what she had on her. When the barista looked at Sienna, she ordered a medium coffee and a blueberry muffin because she'd skipped breakfast and her hands were already starting to shake from low blood sugar, and the total came to $7.15 with tax. Sienna opened her purse and dug around for her wallet, pulled it out, and unzipped the bill section, and her heart sank when she saw exactly 3 $1 bills folded in there. Nothing else, and she definitely didn't have $4.15 in change rattling around her purse. She pulled out the 3 bills and set them on the counter and started checking the zippered coin pocket, hoping for a miracle. Found 65 cents in quarters and dimes and did the math that put her at $3.65 when she needed $7.15. She looked up at the barista who was waiting patiently, and Sienna could feel the line of people behind her getting restless because she was holding things up, and she pressed her thumbnail hard into the side of her index finger. This anxious habit she'd had since she was a kid, and her jaw was working as she tried to figure out what to do. I'm short. I've only got $3.65. Can I just get a small coffee? What's that cost? Sienna said quietly, and the barista checked the register. Small coffee's $4.20 with tax. Do you have a card or can someone with you cover the difference? Sienna glanced at Greg, who was standing slightly off to the side organizing his wallet, and she really didn't want to ask, but she also really needed coffee. Greg, I'm $4 short. My card's not working with the cash. Only thing, can you spot me? I'll pay you back, Sienna said, keeping her voice low because having this conversation in front of 15 strangers was already mortifying enough. Greg looked up from his wallet and his expression did this thing where mild annoyance fought with something that looked like disappointment, and he sighed in this way that made it clear he thought this was a character flaw on her part. I only carry my budgeted cash amount for the day and I don't have extra. Messes up my allocation system, Greg said. And he was saying it like this was a reasonable explanation that Sienna should obviously understand and respect. Sienna stared at him and processed that he had literal $20 bills in his wallet and was refusing to cover $4 because it would inconvenience his spreadsheet, and the barista was looking between them with this uncomfortable expression, and the people in line behind them were definitely listening now because Greg hadn't exactly been quiet. I'm just saying situations like this are avoidable with better planning, Sienna. I'm big on logistical foresight, and carrying exact change is honestly just inefficient. But not carrying any cash at all is equally inefficient from the opposite direction. It's about finding the optimal balance, Greg continued. And Sienna felt her face getting hot, and her thumbnail was digging into her finger hard enough to leave a mark. She looked at the barista and swallowed whatever pride she had left and said, "Just cancel my order. I'm good. Sorry for holding up the line." And she started gathering her $3.65 off the counter with hands that wanted to shake, but she wouldn't let them because she was not going to give Greg the satisfaction of seeing how humiliated she was. The barista looked genuinely sympathetic and opened her mouth like she was going to say something, probably offer to comp the coffee. But before she could, a hand reached past Sienna and dropped four worn $1 bills on the counter next to her crumpled three. Sienna turned and saw a guy standing slightly behind her in line, probably early 30s, wearing work boots and cargo pants and a canvas jacket that had some kind of appliance repair company logo stitched on the chest. And next to him was a kid, maybe 9 or 10, with a backpack covered in superhero pins, looking up at the menu board with intense concentration. The guy didn't look at Sienna or Greg, just kept his eyes on the barista and said in this flat, tired voice, "Put her order on with ours and add a large black coffee and a hot chocolate with whipped cream for the kid." The barista nodded and started ringing it up, and the guy finally looked at Greg, and his expression was so completely done with everything that it would have been funny if the situation wasn't so awful. A guy who talks that much about efficiency should know how to spot a friend, $4 without giving a seminar about his expense tracking system, the guy said, and his tone wasn't angry or confrontational, just exhausted, like he'd witnessed something stupid and felt obligated to point it out. Greg's face went red, and he opened his mouth to respond, but the guy had already turned back to the barista and was pulling out a 20 of his own to pay for everything. Sienna stood there completely off balance, holding her $3 and not knowing what to do with them. And the kid tugged on the guy's jacket sleeve and said, "You said I could get a cookie too." And the guy nodded, "Yeah, you can. Pick which one you want." The kid pressed his face against the bakery case, trying to decide between chocolate chip and oatmeal raisin with the seriousness of someone making a life-altering choice. And Sienna realized her entire assumption about this guy had just been corrected by a 9-year-old. The barista finished the transaction and handed over change and started working on the drinks. And Sienna finally found her voice. "Thank you. You didn't have to do that. I can pay you back." And she held out her $3 like that would somehow cover the four he'd just spent plus his own order. The guy glanced at the bills in her hand and shook his head. "Keep it. Buy yourself lunch later. It's $4, not a mortgage payment." His voice was matter-of-fact, no pride or expectation in it, and Sienna lowered her hand, feeling weird about the whole thing. Greg was still standing there looking like he wanted to defend his expense-tracking philosophy, and the guy gave him one more look that somehow communicated absolute disdain without saying a word. And then he guided the kid toward the pickup counter to wait for their drinks. Sienna grabbed her coffee and muffin when they came up and walked away from Greg without saying goodbye because if she had to listen to one more word about optimization, she was going to lose it. And she found a small table near the window and sat down trying to process what had just happened. She could see the guy and the kid at the pickup counter. The kid was showing him something on a handheld video game, and the guy was nodding and asking questions. They got their drinks, and the kid got his cookie, chocolate chip one apparently, and they headed toward a table on the other side of the cafe. Sienna noticed the guy's canvas work jacket had a torn shoulder seam, not massive, but the kind of rip that would get worse if he kept wearing it. The jacket was clearly good quality, heavy-duty canvas meant for actual work, and Sienna's brain immediately started cataloging how she'd repair that shoulder seam, what kind of reinforcement stitching she'd use, whether the canvas could handle a patch or if it needed to be re-seamed entirely. She sat there drinking coffee she hadn't paid for and eating a muffin she couldn't afford, thinking about that tear and the $4 and the fact that the worst blind date of her life had somehow turned into something else entirely, something she didn't have a name for yet, but that felt less humiliating than it had 5 minutes ago. Sienna finished her coffee and muffin sitting by herself near the window, watching Greg leave the cafe without looking back, and she was gathering up her stuff to head out when she made a decision that was probably 70% genuine gratitude and 30% the professional itch she got whenever she saw damaged fabric that could be saved. She walked over to where the guy and his nephew were sitting. The kid was working through his cookie with methodical dedication, and the guy was scrolling through something on his phone that looked like work emails based on his expression, and Sienna stopped next to their table and waited until he looked up. "Hey, I just wanted to say thank you again for covering that. I know you said don't worry about it, but I work at Parkview Dry Cleaners doing alterations and repairs, and I noticed your jacket's got that tear on the shoulder," Sienna said, keeping her voice matter-of-fact because she didn't want this to sound like pity in reverse. "If you bring it by the shop on Monday, I'll patch and reinforce the canvas. Consider it payback for the $4. We're on Elm Street next to the hardware store." The guy looked at her for a second like he was trying to figure out if this was a genuine offer or some kind of complicated social obligation. And then he glanced down at his shoulder where the tear was and back at Sienna. "You don't have to do that. It's just a work jacket. I've got other," he said. But Sienna could tell he was considering it because good canvas jackets weren't cheap, and this one clearly had some miles on it in a way that meant it was broken in and comfortable. "I'm offering because I want to, not because I feel obligated. That's a nice jacket, and that tear is only going to get worse if you keep wearing it. 10 minutes of stitching, and it'll be solid again," Sienna said, and the guy nodded slowly. "All right, yeah, I appreciate it. I'm Elias, by the way. This is my nephew, Toby. I've got him for the weekend, while my sister works doubles at the hospital." Toby looked up from his cookie long enough to wave, and then went back to the very important business of separating all the chocolate chips to eat them individually. And Sienna introduced herself and told Elias the shop opened at 9 on weekdays, and he could drop the jacket anytime. They exchanged numbers in that casual way people do when they're coordinating a practical transaction. And Sienna left feeling like the morning had somehow turned itself around from complete disaster into something almost okay. Monday afternoon, Elias showed up at Parkview Dry Cleaners around 2 carrying the canvas jacket over his arm, and Sienna was at the big work table in the back, hemming a pair of dress pants when she heard the bell above the front door chime. She walked out front and found Elias looking slightly out of place among the racks of cleaned garments in plastic wrap, and he handed over the jacket, and Sienna examined the tear under the better light, running her fingers along the ripped seam and checking the canvas quality. "This is definitely salvageable. The canvas is still solid, just needs the seam reinforced and a bar tack at the stress point. I can have it done by Thursday if that works." Elias said Thursday was fine and started to leave, but then he paused and looked at the industrial sewing machine Sienna had been working at. This ancient Kansu that had to be at least 40 years old and made a sound like a small diesel engine when it ran. "That machine sounds like it's got a timing issue. The belt's probably stretched or the tension's off. You want me to take a look? I work on motors all day, might be able to adjust it." And Sienna blinked because she'd been fighting with that machine's tension for 3 weeks, and the repair guy wanted $200 just to come look at it. They spent the next 20 minutes with Elias on the floor, adjusting the belt tension and oiling some mechanism Sienna didn't know existed. And when she test ran it, the stitching came out perfect for the first time in weeks. That became the pattern over the next few weeks. Elias would drop off or pick up repair work for his company uniforms or his sister's scrubs that needed patches. And he'd end up fixing something in Sienna's shop, a stuck drawer on the filing cabinet, the flickering fluorescent light that had been driving her crazy, the space heater that only worked on one setting. Sienna would alter his work pants when the hems frayed or reinforce the pockets on his cargo pants that kept ripping from carrying tools, and they'd end up talking while they worked. Easy conversation about their jobs and the specific exhaustion that came from fixing other people's stuff all day. She learned he'd been doing appliance repair for 8 years, worked for a small company that serviced commercial equipment mostly, restaurants and laundromats and grocery stores, spent his days diagnosing why industrial refrigerators stopped cooling or why commercial washers wouldn't drain. He learned she'd been sewing since she was 12, had worked at Parkview for 6 years doing everything from hemming pants to reconstructing vintage wedding dresses, that she liked the work because there was something satisfying about taking something damaged and making it functional again. They were both people who worked with their hands and understood the value of things that could be repaired instead of replaced. And that shared framework made conversation easy in a way Sienna hadn't experienced with most people. Late November came in cold and wet, and one Saturday afternoon, Sienna was finishing up a complicated zipper replacement on a leather jacket when the bell chimed, and she looked up, expecting a customer. But it was Toby, Elias's nephew, wearing his superhero backpack and looking around the shop with open curiosity. "Is my uncle here yet? He said to meet him here at 3 after his hockey practice," Toby said, and Sienna checked her phone and saw it was 3:15. "He's running late, I guess. You can wait in here where it's warm. You got homework or something to work on?" Toby nodded and pulled out a math worksheet and a pencil case, and Sienna cleared a space at the folding table she used for marking alterations. Toby set up his homework operation with the focus of someone who took school seriously, and Sienna went back to her zipper replacement, and they worked in companionable silence for about 20 minutes before Sienna's phone buzzed with a text from Elias. "Freezer repair went sideways, compressor replacement. Gonna be another 30 minutes. Is Toby there?" Sienna texted back that he was fine and working on homework, and Toby looked up when her phone buzzed again. "Is that my uncle?" he asked, and Sienna nodded. "Yeah, he's stuck at a job. Said about 30 more minutes." Toby's face did this thing where he tried to look like it didn't bother him, but Sienna could see the small disappointment, and he went back to his math with slightly less enthusiasm. 45 minutes later, the bell chimed hard, and Elias came through the door, looking stressed and out of breath. His work jacket was covered in what looked like refrigerant stains, and his hair was sticking up like he'd been running his hands through it, and he spotted Toby at the table, and his whole body seemed to relax slightly. Toby looked up from his finished homework, and his face went from carefully neutral to genuinely bright, and he said in this quiet voice that hit Sienna right in the chest, "You came." Elias walked over and crouched down next to the folding table, so he was at eye level with Toby, and his voice was firm and sure when he answered. "Of course I came, buddy." Toby looked back down at his worksheet, organizing his pencils in his case with deliberate precision, and he said it so casually that Sienna almost missed the weight of it. "Most people say they will." Elias's jaw tightened, and he reached over and ruffled Toby's hair gently. "Yeah, well, I'm not most people. You ready to go grab dinner, or are you going to make me wait while you color code those pencils?" Toby cracked a smile and started packing up his stuff, and Sienna watched Elias help him with his backpack, checking that all the zippers were closed and the straps were adjusted right. These careful, deliberate movements that spoke to someone who showed up consistently, even when it was inconvenient. They left and Sienna stood in her empty shop thinking about that exchange, about the way Toby's whole face had changed when Elias walked in, about "most people say they will," coming from a 9-year-old who'd clearly been let down enough times to expect it, and about the absolute certainty in Elias's voice when he said, "Of course I came." Something shifted in Sienna's perception right then. This wasn't just a guy who was nice or helpful. This was someone fundamentally reliable in a way she hadn't encountered often, and that quality hit different than any romantic gesture ever could. December rolled in, and the shop owner, Ray, who was 73 and had run Parkview for 40 years, called Sienna into the tiny back office one afternoon and told her he was retiring at the end of January. "My daughter's been on me to move to Arizona near her and the grandkids, and my doctor says the cold's not doing my arthritis any favors, so I'm selling the business," Ray said. And Sienna felt her stomach drop because she loved this job, and finding another alterations position that wasn't working for some corporate dry cleaning chain was going to be nearly impossible. Ray must have seen her face because he held up his hand. "I'm offering it to you first, Sienna. You know the clients, you know the equipment, you've been keeping this place running the last 2 years. While I've been half retired anyway, I'll sell you the business and the equipment for $60,000. That's less than half what it's worth, but I'd rather see it go to someone who'll take care of it." Sienna sat in the cramped office chair and tried to process what he was saying. $60,000 to own her own business, to not have to worry about corporate policies or getting laid off, to actually build something that was hers. Ray slid a folder across the desk with small business loan information and contact numbers for his accountant. And Sienna took it with hands that wanted to shake because this was everything she'd ever wanted professionally and also the single most terrifying thing she could imagine. She thanked Ray and took the folder home, and that night she sat at her kitchen table staring at the loan paperwork and felt 12 years old again, sitting on the stairs of their rental house listening to her parents fight about money in the kitchen below. Her dad had opened a small appliance repair shop when Sienna was 12. He'd been so excited about it, talked about being his own boss and building something for the family, and Sienna had believed in it because her dad believed in it. The shop lasted 18 months before it went under, drowning in equipment costs and overhead and slow-paying commercial clients, and the debt swallowed everything. They lost the house they'd been renting because her parents couldn't make rent anymore, had to move in with her grandmother for 2 years while they climbed out of the hole. Sienna remembered sitting in her grandmother's basement bedroom, hearing her mom say, "Dreams are expensive, business owners go broke, play it safe," like it was a fundamental law of physics. She'd built her entire adult life on playing it safe, working for someone else, never taking on debt bigger than a car payment, keeping her head down and her expenses low. And the idea of signing loan paperwork for $60,000 made her feel physically sick because she'd watched what business failure did to a family and she couldn't do that. Couldn't risk ending up like her parents, broken and fighting and losing everything. Elias had been texting her, asking if she wanted to grab coffee and catch up. And when he sent another message Tuesday night offering to help her review any paperwork if she needed a second set of eyes on something, Sienna stared at her phone for a long time before typing a response. "I can't do this, Elias. I'm a seamstress, not an owner. I'm withdrawing the application. It's too much risk and I can't handle that kind of debt. Please just give me some space right now." She hit send before she could second guess it, and then put her phone face down on her kitchen counter and went back to staring at the loan paperwork she'd already decided not to sign. And when Elias texted back just okay with nothing else, she told herself that was fine. This was the smart choice, the safe choice. Elias was in a restaurant kitchen 3 miles away when his phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He'd been troubleshooting a walk-in freezer that kept tripping the breaker, and he pulled it out and read Sienna's message twice. He didn't sigh dramatically or slump against the wall. He just read it, absorbed what she was actually saying underneath the words, and quietly put his phone back in his pocket. He stood there in the restaurant kitchen looking at his toolbox sitting open on the tile floor, and his brain shifted entirely into the problem-solving mode he used for complicated repairs. Because Sienna saying she was withdrawing the application wasn't the real problem. The real problem was she was letting fear kill something she wanted because she'd watched someone else fail and decided that meant she would too. And that was a fixable problem if he could figure out the right approach. Friday evening came in dark and cold. One of those December nights where the sun gave up by 4:30 and everything felt heavier in the absence of daylight. And Sienna was alone in the closed dry cleaning shop at 7 p.m., packing her personal sewing kit into a cardboard box she'd pulled from the recycling bin out back. She'd officially told Ray that morning she was declining his offer, watched his face fall with disappointment, but also understanding because he knew her well enough to know she didn't make decisions like this lightly, and he'd told her he'd start looking for other buyers, but she was welcome to stay on as an employee whoever ended up purchasing the place. The shop felt different in the dark with just the security lights on, all the familiar equipment taking on unfamiliar shadows, and Sienna was methodically pulling her personal tools from the drawer at her workstation, the good fabric scissors she'd bought herself, the seam ripper her grandmother had given her, the measuring tape that had her initials written on it in Sharpie. She set each item in the box with careful deliberation, trying not to think about the fact that she was packing up the dream she'd spent 6 years building, trying not to calculate how many wedding dresses she'd restored at this table, or how many customers knew her by name. And the weight of playing it safe felt less like relief and more like surrender. But she couldn't make herself sign those loan papers, couldn't risk turning into her parents fighting in a kitchen about money they didn't have. A firm knock on the glass front door cut through the quiet, and Sienna looked up startled because the shop had been closed for 3 hours, and the close sign was clearly visible. And when she walked to the front, she could see Elias standing on the other side of the glass in his work boots and the canvas jacket she'd patched for him back in November. She unlocked the door and pulled it open, and the cold air rushed in along with the smell of snow that hadn't started falling yet, but was coming, and Elias was holding his heavy red toolbox in one hand and had a multimeter clipped to his belt. And Sienna felt her defenses immediately go up because she'd told him she needed space, and here he was, showing up at her closed shop on a Friday night. "Elias, what are you doing here? I told you I withdrew the application. I'm not buying the place," she said, and her voice came out more sharp than she meant it to, but she was raw and didn't have the energy to soften it. Elias stepped inside without waiting for permission and set his toolbox down on the floor near the counter with a heavy metallic clatter that echoed in the empty shop. And he looked at her with that same flat, exhausted expression he'd had in the coffee shop when Greg was being an ass about $4. "I know you withdrew it. Ray asked me to assess the equipment before listing. When you pulled out, I figured the numbers didn't work, so I did the math myself," Elias said. And Sienna gripped the edge of the counter because of course Ray had called him. Ray used Elias's company for all the appliance maintenance. "Then you know I'm not doing this, so why are you here?" Sienna said. And she could hear how defensive she sounded, how scared. And Elias pulled a wrench from his tool belt and set it on the counter between them. "The main reason you can't afford the loan is because the industrial steam press is failing, and replacement cost is another $18,000 on top of the 60 for the business. You'd have to finance it separately, which puts the total debt over 80 grand, Elias said, and his voice was calm and measured like he was diagnosing a broken appliance. "But if the press was functional, the loan would be manageable for you. Is that accurate?" Sienna blinked because she hadn't told Elias any of those details, had just sent a text saying she couldn't do it, and now he was standing in her shop at 7 p.m. on a Friday, breaking down the exact math that had killed her dream. "Yeah, that's accurate. The press is shot, the heating elements burned out, and the pressure valve sticks. Ray got a quote for replacement, and it was ridiculous. But I don't see what that has to do with anything. I'm still not signing loan papers for 60,000, let alone 80. Her voice cracked slightly on the numbers, and she hated how weak it sounded. Elias looked at her, and his expression softened just slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was low and incredibly steady. "You spend all day fixing things for other people, Sienna. You take damaged wedding dresses and broken zippers and torn work jackets, and you make them whole again. Why is your own future the one thing you're willing to leave broken?" The question hit her like a physical thing, and she opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out because she didn't have an answer that didn't sound like cowardice. Elias didn't wait for her to find words, just picked up his toolbox and walked past her toward the back of the shop where the industrial equipment was. "When I assessed the equipment, I saw the main industrial steam press is failing. I can't sign the loan papers for you, and I wouldn't even if I could because this has to be your choice. But I know how to fix a pressurized boiler valve, and I know where to source a replacement heating element for about $300 instead of 18,000, Elias said, and he was already setting his toolbox down next to the massive steam press that took up half the back wall. This industrial beast that weighed probably 400 pounds and looked like something from a 1970s factory. "If the press is functional, the loan becomes 60,000. So let me fix the thing that's breaking your math." Sienna stood there watching him pull tools from his box, a socket set and a pipe wrench and some kind of pressure gauge, and her pride was screaming at her to tell him to stop, that she didn't need him to fix her problems. But her exhausted practical side was doing the math on $300 versus 18,000 and coming up with 15 months of loan payments saved. "Why are you doing this? You don't owe me anything. I patched your jacket and you fixed my sewing machine. We're even," Sienna said. And Elias was already disconnected the power supply to the press and removing the access panel on the side. "I'm not doing this because I owe you. I'm doing this because you're about to let fear make a decision that you're going to regret for the next 20 years. And I've seen enough people give up on things they want because someone else failed first," Elias said. And he was shining a flashlight into the guts of the machine, examining the heating element. Your dad's business failing doesn't mean yours will. Different industry, different decade, different person running it. You're not him, Sienna. She felt something crack in her chest hearing him say that out loud. The thing she'd been thinking, but couldn't make herself believe, and she walked over and stood next to him, looking at the exposed machinery. I don't know how to do this. How to take on that kind of debt and not panic every time a client pays late or equipment breaks, Sienna said quietly. And Elias was working a wrench around the boiler coupling, trying to loosen the seized pressure valve. You do it the same way you do everything else, one day at a time, one repair at a time, and you let people help you carry the weight when it gets too heavy, instead of trying to do it all solo and burning out, he said. And the valve finally broke free, and he carefully removed it, examining the buildup on the threads. Hand me that flashlight so I can see the element connection. This would go faster with two people. Sienna picked up the heavy flashlight and angled it where he was pointing, and they worked together for the next 2 hours, taking apart the steam press and documenting what needed to be replaced. And Elias explained each component and what it did, and how much the parts would cost, and the final estimate came to $420 in parts, and a weekend of labor he wasn't charging her for, because he said he'd been wanting to take apart an industrial steamer for years, and she was doing him a favor. And the loan amount dropped from $80,000 to $60,000, and suddenly the whole thing felt less like drowning and more like something Sienna could actually survive. By 9:30, they had a plan, a parts list, and a timeline that put the press back online in 2 weeks. Ray had already agreed to hold the listing and let them do the assessment, with repair costs deducted from the sale price if Sienna went through with it. She walked Elias to the front door, and they stood there in the dark shop, and Sienna felt like she should say something meaningful about what he'd just done, but the words weren't coming together right. Thank you for this, for not listening when I said I needed space, for showing up anyway, she said, and Elias shouldered his toolbox. That's what people do when they care about each other. They show up, especially when it's hard. You would have done the same for me. He said it with such certainty that Sienna realized he was right. She would have. And maybe that's what partnership actually looked like. Not keeping score, but just consistently showing up. 6 months later, on a warm day in late June, Sienna was standing behind the counter of Parkview Dry Cleaners, except the sign out front now said, Parkview Dry Cleaners, under new management. Sienna Marsh, proprietor. And the shop wasn't making her rich, but it was stable. She was covering her loan payments and her overhead and actually paying herself a decent salary. The equipment all worked because Elias had spent 3 weekends in January rebuilding half of it, and her client base had grown because word got around that the new owner did expert restoration work on vintage garments. The bell above the door chimed, and Elias walked in on his lunch break, wearing his work clothes and the canvas jacket she'd patched, and Sienna smiled and reached under the counter where she kept the cash register. She pulled out 4 worn $1 bills that she'd been saving specifically for this, and she slid them across the counter toward him. Elias looked at the money and then at her face, confused. What's this? He asked, and Sienna kept her expression neutral. The money I owed you, from the coffee shop, $4. Elias picked up the bills and examined them like they might be counterfeit. I thought we settled that about 7 months ago when you fixed my jacket. And Sienna leaned against the counter, grinning now. We did, so if we're even then you should stay for dinner tonight. I'm making pasta and I bought actual good wine, not the $7 stuff. Elias laughed and pocketed the $4 and said, Yeah, I can do dinner. And Sienna felt this quiet contentment settle in her chest, not fireworks or dramatic romance, but something steadier and more reliable. The feeling of building something solid with someone who showed up consistently, even when it was inconvenient. We spend so much time letting fear convince us that our dreams are too expensive to repair, believing that playing it safe is the only way to survive. But when Elias walked into that dark shop with a toolbox instead of an exit strategy, he proved you don't have to face a broken system alone. Real partnership isn't about someone handing you success or rescuing you from your life. It's built over a groaning industrial steam press, stitched into the seams of a torn canvas jacket, and forged by 2 people deciding that fixing things together is always better than walking away. Because sometimes the right person doesn't rescue you, they just hand you a flashlight and help you share the weight.